Aloha and welcome to Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute. Living here in Hawaii, our conversations ultimately turn to the economy. The cost of living is something everyone is conscious of, but we're not always aware of the factors that affect our cost of living. For example, we do know vaguely that a 1920s shipping law called the Jones Act has some impact, and I'm grateful for the conversations about the Jones Act that have taken place increasingly in the last couple of years. But there are very few who really understand some of the economic thinking that goes into understanding the Jones Act. Today, we're going to have an opportunity to talk to one of the most important, I believe most important, economists here in the state of Hawaii, a professor at Hawaii Pacific University, and a scholar at the Grassroot Institute. He's known for his views on analyzing hard-to-analyze issues, especially as he promotes the free market. Would you welcome to the program with me today, Ken Schoolland. Ken, aloha, my friend.
Thank you very much, Keli'i.
Always great to have conversations with you. They're a real delight to me.
Well, I enjoy it very much myself.
You know, Ken, one of the things that inevitably you and I talk about is really what the economy should be like. I think here in Hawaii, we've gotten used to a certain mode of economy where government plays a big role, where established monopolies play a big role and so forth. And most of us as people just try to work out a living. But there's a different vision of economy, isn't there?
Yes, definitely. I think that we all stand to gain a great deal more in prosperity and freedom when we have a freer market economy.
Now, that concept, free market, not a lot of people understand that. I think when I use it, sometimes people think I'm talking about the swap meet, or places where you might give things away for free. But free market has a very distinctive meaning. What is that?
Well, you recall, as you and I are both old enough to remember the long Cold War, when it was usually an ideological frame of setting out the command economy of the Eastern Europe, the Soviet Empire, and China, and so on, relative to the Western world that was promoting free markets. And that was the ideological contrast. And we always argued as a matter of policy for our country that free markets were going to be better than controlled economies.
It was kind of obvious then what the difference between a free market and a controlled market are. You had in the Soviet Union the GOS plan, a five-year plan by the government that controlled how many green cars are made in what city and where they got distributed. So the government played the biggest role in determining supply and demand. And then you had in the United States, at least at one point in our history, efforts to let the market determine the supply and demand. So how would you actually define what a free market is?
Well, I think of it along the lines that are promoted by the Fraser Institute in Canada, that set out the Economic Freedom of the World Index. They look at 5 basic criteria: the level of taxes and government spending, the levels of certainty in the legal structure and contracts, the soundness of money, the openness to trade, and the degrees of control of the regulatory structure for an economy. And where they measure these in the various countries of the world, they find that the countries that are they have the greatest amount of economic freedom also have the greatest amount of growth. They have the greatest amount of prosperity, overwhelmingly. They also have the lowest infant mortality, the highest levels of literacy, the highest levels of enjoyment of better environmental quality, and all kinds of things that work in the favor of the population.
That's right.
As a practical consequence. But I'd say there's also a humanitarian benefit of this. The people who are the most poor and most are treated much, much better in those kinds of countries, and that's why people from around the world want to move to those places, because they have a much better prospect of life and opportunity where they have a great deal more freedom.
Well, you've said 2 things at least that I think a lot of people don't realize. The first is that we actually can tangibly measure what economic freedom is. You mentioned the Economic Freedom of the World report, and there is also the Economic Freedom of North America, and as you know, Grassroot Institute, we're one of the co-publishers of that with the Fraser Institute. And it helps countries know exactly where they stand, and states know where they stand in terms of having economic freedom. But you also mentioned that the places where there's more economic freedom, something that might surprise people, you have more humanitarian results in society. You have less poverty. You have less need for welfare as well. You've got less homelessness and so forth. Doesn't that go against the grain of the image some people have of free markets? They think of Gordon Gekko of Wall Street. They think of unregulated, evil corporate empires without any restraint whatsoever. What do you say to that stereotype of the free market?
Well, competition is certainly the way that consumers and workers, investors are all benefited, because by having choice, they will choose for themselves what are the better things to buy, what are the better things to invest in, where are the better places to set your company down and hire people. And by freedom of choice, you're getting a lot of opportunity for people to make better judgments than if it's made by central planning. Government officials, often corrupt and easily influenced by special interest groups, to shape people in a direction that isn't in their best interest.
So you'd say that government is just as corruptible as private enterprise?
Oh, most definitely. As a matter of fact, where the greatest trouble comes in is where they work together, the politicians and very influential, powerful private sector people, in collusion against the general population. And that's what Adam Smith and all the free market economists have warned against, allowing government to give special favors, monopolies, charters, tax breaks, subsidies that give a privilege to some at the expense of the general population.
And isn't it the case that classical economists like Adam Smith are not really saying that people in the business world are better people than people in government? They generally concede, similar to a Christian frame of reference, that all people are fallen and all people are capable of doing something wrong, except that when government does it, government has a special power when it can tax.
Yeah, they have a
and make
monopoly
laws.
power of force at their hands. And in the marketplace, yeah, there are good and bad people, but at least in a free society, they're held in check by competition. The consumers don't have to buy their product. They can choose others. It's only when when they get government on their side that they can compel the consumer to buy their product regardless of the quality or the price and the services.
Well, this idea of competition, I'd like to punctuate it for a moment with you, because I'm going to need to give our viewers some direction here, and that is that we're going to be soon talking about the Jones Act. But at first I wanted to have Professor Schoolland establish some basic economic principles. And one of them that we really need to understand in order to do an analysis of the Jones Act is this idea of competition. So you've said that competition is good for the market, because competition means businesses compete with each other, and in the end, the consumer is the one that wins. And ultimately for the economy, the better businesses survive, and you ultimately have a freer market that works well. What happens when government is involved? Well, what happens to competition in general when government decides to become a major factor in one of the industries?
Well, when the government becomes involved with outlawing competition, giving a monopoly, a privilege to one at the expense of others, then of course the marriage is between that special interest group, whether it be farmers or bankers or military contractors or whatever, and government officials that they help get into power and positions through their campaign contributions. I mean, one would like to think that in democracy we have a free and open electoral system, but I think a realistic view of our political system is that it has been very much corrupted by the massive campaign contributions and the massive amount of favors that the government has to hand out to their friends and ways of punishing their enemies. And so this works definitely against the consumers and taxpayers on a broad base. And this isn't new. It's been throughout history. It's the kind of thing that Adam Smith railed against the mercantilist policies of England, massive trade barriers and trade restrictions, and even the war. Adam Smith opposed England's war in the American colonies, said, let them alone. It's this empire that is harmful to the general population, at a benefit to maybe the British East India Company and certain merchants, but at the expense of the general taxpayer and consumer.
So when government gets involved in promoting and regulating an industry, invariably that impacts the level of competition.
Oh yeah, definitely.
They're favored players rather than robust competition between individual companies. As a result, consumers have fewer choices. And isn't there also less incentive for productive change, less incentive for creativity. If you have a monopoly over a market or an oligopoly or a favored place in a market, you don't want to rock the boat. You just want to keep other people out.
Consider how it used to be considered the monopoly of the telephone system throughout America by AT&T was a necessary thing. We couldn't imagine what competition would do. Okay, if you have to spend $10 a minute to make a call from Hawaii to Alaska, or $1 a minute to call to the mainland.
That's
I mean,
right.
it was all for the best interests of the country. But once we broke up that monopoly, eliminated the legal protections to AT&T and broke it up and allowed competition, then we have had these things,
that's
these
right.
smartphones that bring to us
Can do anything with
1,000
this.
things other than just making a phone call, and at a fraction of the cost, maybe at almost no cost per call. All of that came about by the marvels of competition and innovation, lower prices, better service that occurred because of competition. None of that happens when you have a government-sanctioned monopoly, whether it's the government operating it or government giving that to a privileged special interest group.
So competition brings more variety for the consumer, it brings better products, it brings growth in industries and so forth. Can competition also improve society and protect industries such as restaurants from serving bad food, or the environment from being polluted and so forth?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that in my opinion, pollution is a form of aggression. And if you were really allowed to prosecute, bring lawsuit against aggressors in society, then the courts would be on the side of people who were trying to put out of business polluters. Unfortunately, so much of the law has sided with the polluters by allowing them in the public interest to be able to pollute to a certain allowable degree. And that's, I think it's done a great harm to the general population as a result.
Before we take a quick break, I want us to set the stage for our Jones Act discussion by asking you this question. What are some of the signs or the indicators that here in the state of Hawaii, we're not really experiencing a free market? What are some of the signs that we really don't have a high level of competition?
Well, the one is, of course, the Jones Act, which limits our shipping and therefore raises the cost of all of our goods and services, and the cost of shipping to the mainland. But also the high tax rates that we have here, the very, very tightly controlled land use, and other kinds of things. We have the homeless problem, and I would say that owes a lot of it to the barriers against mobile homes and trailer parks that are not allowed here in the islands. To transportation, where it's illegal to compete with the bus. You know, the Public Utilities Commission outlawed competition with the bus back in 1940, and therefore we've got the same kind of monopoly, inefficiencies and high costs that we expect of government monopolies. And without these kinds of problems, I think we'd have a much more livable society, much, much lower costs, and much more consumer-friendly in the islands.
In the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World report. And you may recall that I was able to participate in a planning session recently for the next coming edition, and was stunned to learn that there are several states in Mexico that are ranked higher on the Economic Freedom of the World report than Hawaii.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes.
I want to have that for my classes.
But why might that be, without getting into the minutia of the report?
Well, actually, I have found the same thing in China. The Fraser Institute has come up with, you know, China overall ranks kind of low on the Economic Freedom of the World Index. They're coming up gradually, but certain provinces of China, and China is such a huge country, the provinces are bigger than many countries of the world by population. Some of the provinces of China are among the freest in the world, above Hong Kong and Singapore, and other provinces of China are off the bottom of the list. And it's the engines of growth are those provinces that are free, and they're moving a lot of people are moving from the poorest and most tightly controlled provinces to the freest, where all the growth and prosperity is occurring.
Well, we might want to import some of that to Hawaii.
Yeah.
We're watching Ehana Kako on the Think Tech Hawaii broadcast network. My guest today is Professor Ken Schoolland of Hawaii Pacific University and a Grassroot Institute scholar. Don't go away, because when we come back, we'll apply these economic principles to understanding a little bit more about the Jones Act.
Aloha, my name is Reg Baker, and I'm the host of Business in Hawaii with Reg Baker. Business in Hawaii is a program that is positive stories about business in Hawaii. We're tired of hearing the negativity and why it's the wrong place to have a business. We talk about the positive reasons for having a business in Hawaii and how to be successful. We broadcast live every Thursday at 2 o'clock. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Hi, I'm Chris Leatham, and I'd like to invite you to come and watch my show every Wednesday at 3. I'm interested in a variety of issues that have to do with politics and our local business economy. And I'd like to bring on guests who like to talk about everything from technology to social media to what we can be doing to improve our environment. And so I'd like to invite you every Wednesday at 3 to stay and watch my show here with Think Tech Hawaii. And I'll see you there.
Welcome back to Ehana Kako. We're here every week on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I just have to take my hat off to the wonderful folks at Think Tech, the great staff, and our producer Jay Fidel, who every week put on about 30 to 35 hours of original content emanating from downtown Honolulu and going across the world. And you can engage that content at thinktechhawaii.com. Well, today we're talking about the economy, and a different vision of the economy from being one in which there's central control over industries by the government, where government sets supply and demand to a large degree, where government fails to necessarily provide the conditions for a free economy, such as the protection of property rights and so forth. We're looking at a contrast to that and a vision perhaps of a free economy. And one of the important aspects of a free economy is the ability of businesses to compete robustly without heavy levels of government intervention. I'm going to talk with Ken Schoolland about this a little more now as we bring this to bear upon understanding the Jones Act. Ken, the Jones Act, it can mystify people just to say the Jones Act. You can be at a party and having a conversation and you want to end it.
Yeah.
Say, now let's talk about the Jones Act. It used to be religion or sex. Now it's the Jones Act. But let's just be very simple. Start at the very, very basics. This law that goes back to 1920s that regulates shipping of cargo between two American ports. That consists of 5 basic planks. What are they?
Well, the basic principle of this was that those in 1920, at the end of World War I, had no confidence that the American shipbuilding industry could compete on the world market, that they needed a special protection, that any traffic taking cargo from one American port to another American port, along the coastline or on rivers or between Hawaii and Los Angeles or Alaska, had to be on an American-made ship.
It's number one.
It had to be owned by Americans and had to have an American crew, an American flag, therefore. And that really represented a lack of confidence that they had in shipbuilding in America, that it could exist without this shielding from international competition.
Okay, so from the very start, the purpose of the Jones Act was economic protectionism. In other words, to protect an industry that we had in the United States, the shipbuilding industry, the industry that built these deep-bottomed ships that carried cargo, and instead of letting them compete robustly across the world with others, they would be protected from that competition. You know, that kind of sounds like exactly what we did in Detroit, to our automobile industry at a time we had these huge General Motors vehicles. In fact, you could buy any kind of General Motors of your choice. But we had a Ford and we had some other companies. And we were so insecure about that, we wanted to protect them from these new technologies of these efficient little cars being made in Japan. What happened to our capacity to build cars?
Yeah, by shielding off the competition, you become complacent. You lose all the competitive edge that can leave you state of the art and most competitive on worldwide.
You remember back in those days where when you talked about quality, you weren't talking about an American car, you were talking about a foreign car. And it was because the foreign cars had to compete But we didn't let them compete because we put on these huge tariffs and these trade restrictions to protect our little industry. And I think it's pretty obvious that we damaged the American automobile industry until we finally turned that protectionism around.
Yeah, I think the original proponents of this had in mind shielding domestic shipbuilders from international competition, but they couched it in terms of national security, which a lot of times people will go along with because they think, well, okay, yeah, I'm in for national security. How does this help us? And it reminds me of the 19th century economist Henry George, who said, protectionism teaches us to do to ourselves in peacetime what the enemy would do to us in wartime. I mean, what does the enemy want to do? Now, fresh in his mind was the Civil War. Of course, the northern states put a blockade and cut off the southern states from international shipping. What does the Jones Act do to us? It cuts us off from international shipping.
It creates an embargo, which is precisely what we'd like to do to our belligerent during times of warfare. And so let me make sure that I understand what you're saying here. You're saying that the ultimate purpose of the Jones Act from the beginning was a form of economic protectionism, which is a bad thing. It doesn't help an industry whatsoever. It stunts the growth of an industry. But it got sold on the surface by being a form of national security, national defense. In other words, we'd have more ships out there, presumably with more sailors out there, who during times of warfare could be deputized, could be put into our military fleet. So that's how they sold it. Let's look at the reality now. When the Jones Act was issued in about 1920, weren't we one of the largest ship producers on the face of the earth?
Yeah, we had a huge fleet, and over the years, now since then, it's dwindled to less than 1% of the global shipping market, and it's all domestic.
Less than 1%.
Yeah.
That's incredible to believe that in an industry in which we were a leader in the beginning of the century, 1920s, over the course of the 20th century, we became one of the smallest players. And was that because of the Jones Act?
Yes, I think absolutely. And so much has changed since then, too. Like, for example, since the 1920s, we now have great alliances, mutual security alliances with South Korea and Japan. They produce some of the best ships in the world. They're the biggest producers of ships, as South Korea is. I think Japan is about third largest. They produce ships probably 1/5 the price of American built ships. State-of-the-art, best stuff going. And yet we're not allowed to use those ships in shipping from Hawaii to Los Angeles.
Because that's part of protecting our shrinking shipbuilding industry. So
The irony is that here now the South Koreans, we have troops stationed, over 100,000 troops and dependents and civilian personnel stationed in Japan and South Korea as mutual defense allies. We're not allowed to buy their ships because we don't trust them to build a ship that would be used for our national security purposes.
So what has happened then is we've created an artificial scarcity of American-built ships.
Yeah.
Now, let's go back to our basic economics, supply and demand. When the supply shrinks and the demand grows, what happens to the price?
Our prices in Hawaii are considered very high. I've seen estimates, and now they vary. I think one estimate is that it could be as much as $3,000 per household per year in higher costs from this shipping. But I've heard other people say, no, it's not so much. But to me, it doesn't matter the amount. What matters is your freedom to choose it.
That's
because
right.
The miracles of the marketplace and competition will bring about all kinds of benefits that we can't foresee until the barriers are gone.
So we experience the rising cost on at least two fronts. As you mentioned, the consumer experiences it. But in addition to that, the shipbuilding industry experiences that because the ships themselves, or the shippers, the people who ship products as well as ship owning companies, they experience the high cost of ships. How much do American-built ships cost now because of the protectionism compared to ships across the world?
Well, there are a lot of, it's a very complicated area, but generally speaking, I think you can find examples of comparable ships that are 5 times more expensive made by, and there are many kinds of ships that aren't even made by American shipbuilding companies. There's some dispute about whether or not even American shipbuilding companies will make some kinds of ships that could bring in liquefied natural gas, for example, to the islands here. The technical details aside, it's preventing people from making these judgments for themselves. It's saying that the politicians and the regulatory agencies are better at making these judgments for us than we ourselves in the free market. And that's something that's contrary to everything this country has stood for and preached to the world throughout the last half of the century. Throughout the Cold War, we said that the free markets are better than command and control, central planning. And yet we're behaving so much like that ourselves. We're denying our very, very basic principles, and therefore we're undermining our economies, and therefore we're undermining our national security. You can't have a strong national security if you undermine and destroy the economy. That's why the northern states wanted to blockade the southern states. They were trying to cripple the economy so that they could therefore cripple their capacity for military defense.
Today, one of the arguments put forth most frequently opposing any reform or change of the Jones Act is that it is necessary for our national security. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's just exactly the opposite. It's necessary for our national security to allow the most freedom and choice. If we're able to buy ships at 1/5 the price from the world market, look at how much that saves all of our consumers, who are then so much richer to be able to buy so many more things. And it's not just the consumers, it's the Defense Department. The Defense Department budget here in Hawaii depends on, well, how much can you buy with the Defense Department budget? And if they have to pay so much more costs, higher costs here in the islands, they can't do as much with their Defense Department budget.
Isn't there a contradiction here too, that if the defense of the Jones Act is that we need to have as many American-built ships as possible to mobilize during times of war, that the Jones Act has actually reduced the number of American ships available severely, creating a critical shortage, actually, even for commerce purposes.
We've seen during emergencies of Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, the BP oil spill off the Gulf
British
of
Petroleum.
Mexico. During these emergencies, there were other ships from other countries that could have cleaned up the oil spill, could have brought salt and sand to the people of New York when it was necessary to bring all kinds of emergency relief. And so they've asked for waivers during emergencies, but why should it only be in emergencies? If the economy is so much better served by international shipping, then certainly we should allow that. We should allow that choice. We shouldn't cut ourselves off from the world of shipping. I mean, would we cut ourselves off from the world of everything else because we want to be totally insulated and produce everything by ourselves, in which case we would be producing very little. We would be an impoverished country. We would cripple ourselves with these trade barriers.
Let's do some alternate economic projection from back in the 1920s. Let's look at America with a strong shipbuilding industry then, and imagine a century of no Jones Act. What would we be able to expect with regard to American ships today?
That's a great one. I think that we would have a much stronger shipping fleet that's made in America, because they're competing and have for almost 100 years been competing internationally with the best producers around the world. We would have a modern fleet.
We'd be making the Audi or the Ferrari, the Mercedes of ships today.
The average age of American ships now is much older than the average age of international ships. And that means that a ship like the El Faro, as controversy has been raised about it, it was such an old ship, it broke down under the storm circumstances. And if it hadn't been such an old ship and had been state-of-the-art new ship, it probably would have survived the storm and saved those people on board. Some years ago, during the Persian Gulf crisis in 1987.
Yes.
The SS Stark was attacked by an Exocet cruise missile that killed 37 American sailors. Now, I remember that the American Navy was sent to the Persian Gulf at that time with the express purpose of guaranteeing freedom of the seas. And yet, isn't it ironic that we are not allowed freedom of the seas here in the islands? I think a tribute to those fallen sailors would be to allow the same kind of freedom of the seas here in the Hawaiian Islands, to be able to send and buy and sell goods from Los Angeles to Hawaii as we were championing in the Persian Gulf for oil.
Well,
that means that we cannot sell our sugar on a ship that goes to California that's state-of-the-art shipping. We were more likely to face competition then from the Philippines or Thailand because we have the disadvantage of higher cost shipping, and we can't buy our products from
We'll be right back and continue this conversation. You're listening to Professor Kenneth Schoolland talking about the Jones Act. When we return after the short break, I'm going to ask Ken what the impact on the Hawaii economy has been, and how can we craft a path forward into a freer market future with respect to shipping. Don't go away, we'll be right back.
Hi, my name's Hillary Weinberg. I'm the host of The Whole Gamut on Think Tech Hawaii. See us live every Tuesday at 1 p.m. or on our YouTube channel to hear us talk about world affairs from Hawaii and beyond. See you then.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Ted Ralston. Ted is the host of Where the Road Leads. It shows every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's about technology. It's about how people collaborating and solve problems with modern technology. It's where the road leads. We all know that. We should all be listening. Join us there, 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday. Now, what about that do you agree with?
All of it.
I knew he'd say that. Aloha. Say aloha.
Aloha.
Good.
Welcome back again to Ehana Kako. We're in our concluding segment for today, and I'm just so appreciative of your viewing. At the Grassroot Institute, we say Ehana Kako, which sounds like an older Hawaiian saying, e pule kako, meaning let's pray together. We say Ehana Kako, let's work together. Let's work together for a better economy, government, and society. Because think of the alternative, not working together. Then we end up nowhere whatsoever. Ken Schoolland is one of the scholars at the Grassroot Institute who does work with other people toward productive solutions. And one of those solutions, Ken, that we have been working on is a freer market future, a future for Hawaii where we have less central control over the economy and more choice for individuals and businesses and a far more robust economy. How much is this an important issue with regard to the Jones Act? What I mean to say is this. How much would modifying the Jones Act in a productive way improve the free market of Hawaii?
I think it's one of the biggest cost factors here in the islands. It's subtle because people, when they go to the grocery store, they see the price of things high. But they don't really notice, well, why is it? And they don't notice it's not a tax on things. It's subtle because it's hidden behind the regulatory cost of things. And but I think it would be very dramatic. It would bring things, costs down for all of us. And it would mean that life would be so much more livable here. If your money buys a lot more, it's like you've gotten a pay raise. It means that our young people don't leave to the mainland when they are looking for work, when they're trying to find a home. They can more easily afford to stay here. And it becomes a much more pleasant life for all the people in Hawaii.
Now, states that have large coastal regions have been impacted perhaps the most by the Jones Act because they are interacting with shipping much more. States like Alaska.
Yeah.
And Alaska's legislature has passed a law requiring the governor to lobby Washington, D.C. for repeal or modification of the Jones Act. That's how serious they are about it. Well, we're impacted even more, being surrounded by water completely, 360 degrees, yet our legislators are not taking the action of the Alaskans.
I first learned about the Jones Act when I was living up in Alaska.
Yes.
And I visited with the chief accountant at the Alaska Lumber and Pulp Company.
What'd you learn there?
And she said that they could sell their pulp just sending it down the coast to Seattle on an American ship, but it was cheaper for them to send it all the way to Tokyo and then back to Seattle on a non-Jones Act ship because it was so expensive on a Jones Act ship. Ultimately, Alaska Lumber and Pulp went out of business, many costs, and that was one of the biggest ones. You know, can you imagine having to have to send it all the way to Tokyo and then to Seattle, just so you have a foreign port in between?
I've heard that story over and over again. I spoke with one of the largest ranchers on the Big Island, and because of the shipping costs, they also tried to get around the Jones Act regulations, so they would get a ship that goes from South Korea to Vancouver and then truck their product down to San Francisco and then get on a Jones Act ship to Hawaii. And that was their cheaper solution, but they ultimately went out of the cattle business because they couldn't get the feed that they needed and so forth, and couldn't ship out as well at a competitive rate. So how would you envision a change in Hawaii with regard to the Jones Act? What should we change about the Jones Act? Is short of repealing the whole 1920 Federal Act, which might be a politically difficult thing, are there things that can be done to make it more livable?
Well, I personally would like to see the Jones Act repealed, but short of that, I would be content with partial measures. If they were able to just lift the requirement on American-built shipping, so that shippers could purchase a ship more cheaply, that would be okay. But frankly, I'm in favor of free trade and free markets, and I think that there are problems with every aspect of the Jones Act. But I'll take what I can get.
Well, let's take a look at that first measure, eliminating the requirement that any ship that carries cargo between American ports be built in the United States. What are some of the concerns that opponents have about ships being built overseas? Isn't the most common concern that we would be worried about national security with ships that have been built elsewhere?
Yeah, but you know, the same argument, national security, can be raised about everything. How about airplanes? You know, should Hawaiian Airlines not be allowed to buy its Airbus planes because they're made in Europe? Should we not be able to buy Toyotas and Hondas because, well, our vehicles should be made in America too? If we did that, insisted on that, imagine how costly everything would be without the competition from these international sources, and how much less innovation and opportunities we'd have. In fact, some say that if you allowed the cost of shipping to go down and open it up, I mean, then Pearl Harbor could be once again as busy a harbor as it was once, you know, filled with ships. And I'd say there'd be a lot more jobs for longshoremen with a lot more ships in the harbor at lower costs than there are now with so few ships.
Well, that leads us to another issue. There's a frequent argument that if we remove the requirement that ships be built in America in order to do cargo transport between American ports, that we would lose jobs for union shipbuilders and so forth.
Well, the thing is, there are workers on all sides. Yes, there's a worker in an American shipbuilding yard that might lose a job, but there are many other workers in America who are enriched by being able to buy their products much more cheaply. I mean, you could say, well, we have to protect buggy whip makers because, well, you know, they would lose their jobs if we were allowed to use automobiles instead of buggies. But buggy whip makers, we have to protect that particular kind of job. But no, this is a dynamic market. People, it's always changing. It's you leave behind industries that are not competitive, and you go to industries that are more competitive. That's the strength and dynamism of our economy. That's why America has become strong, because they embraced change. Whereas in Europe, they're slower and behind that. Remember, they have a much more rigid labor market, and they don't allow people to shift from one kind of job to another as easily. So they and many other countries even worse than that. So they stay behind. You know, they don't progress as much as they can.
Isn't it the case in a parallel industry, automobile manufacturing, that we've seen competition, which has been allowed increasingly over the last decades, actually build the American automobile industry far more than protectionism did?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. Competition is the best way to get new ideas, better service, better prices, then if you shield the market, I think sugar in Hawaii is a kind of way of demonstrating that. We shielded sugar, protected it from all outside competition, and it's almost gone. Shielding it didn't guarantee its future. You know, you just cut it off from all the incentives for the same kind of innovation and change that are necessary for growth.
As we take a look at the Jones Act of the future, if we can at least begin with opening up the possibility of buying our ships from outside of the United States, where would we look?
South Korea.
South Korea. Tell us about their shipbuilding there.
They're the biggest shipbuilder in the world as far as I know, and I think they produce very efficiently, state-of-the-art, meaning the best of technology that is also environmentally friendly, meaning they use engine efficiencies and various kinds of controls and fuels and all that are much more environmentally friendly than the things that are built in America. And just the fact that they're so much more cost effective. Now, it's if we're going to have so many thousands of troops stationed in South Korea to protect them and their national security as a part of our national security, then we should be doing business with them. How can we say that? How can they have confidence in us that we're really an ally if we won't buy their products?
And isn't it the case that the United States Navy itself purchases ships from South Korea and other allies to use when it's not in need of an aircraft carrier or a cruiser, which must be built in the United States, but when they need logistic ships for flotillas and so forth?
Yeah, the U.S. Military routinely gets waivers from the Jones Act.
Isn't
to get
this
what
called
they need.
the Sea Lift Command?
Yeah, and you could also say Puerto Rico is on the verge of bankruptcy, and some people say that it's to a great extent also because they're impacted by the Jones Act. Consider American Samoa and Samoa. American Samoa, because it's a territory, can't use the shipping that Samoa can use. So because of the high cost of living, factories are closing down in one and moving over to the other. Well, the same thing is happening in Hawaii. Hawaii is being hurt by the higher cost of living, which affects our tourist business as well. Tourists find it expensive to go to Hawaii for a vacation, so we'll find a cheaper place. We'll go to Cancun or to Miami or to other places around the world. So it places all of our industries at a competitive disadvantage.
You mentioned Puerto Rico, and one of the major causes of the demise of its economy has been the Jones Act, and protectionism. Now ships aren't going there at all for any major cargo ships. They're going to Jamaica, which is exempt from the Jones Act because it's outside of the United States. Do you think that what we see happening in Puerto Rico portends what may be happening and may happen in the future of Hawaii?
Yes, absolutely, yeah, sure. And Alaska, too.
I can hear people saying that sounds so far-fetched. Because wouldn't we have the government to intervene, print more money and prop up our economy, issue ration?
That's the irony. I think it was L. Neil Smith that says the government behaves like a disease masquerading as its own cure. In other words, every time it creates a problem with one kind of regulatory control, then it says, well, we'll rescue you with another kind of government program, until you have an endless maze of government programs to solve the problems of the previous one.
That's right. Ken, your wisdom has been delightful. Thank you for joining us today and informing us more about the free market and the Jones Act.
Thank you very much for having me.
Glad to have you anytime. Today we've been talking with my friend Ken Schoolland, a professor of economics at Hawaii Pacific University and a scholar at the Grassroot Institute. He's also the author of The Adventures of Jonathan Gullible, A Free Market Odyssey, which is a delightful text that will introduce children of all ages, all the way up to 100, to principles about the free market. Until next time, I'm Keli'i Akina of the Grassroot Institute on E Hana Kako, broadcasting on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. Aloha.